Hello and welcome to episode 639 of the People Behind the Science podcast. Listeners, today we are excited to be resharing our conversation with Dr. Jon Butterworth, and this interview was originally published on September 9th of 2015. Jon is an accomplished particle physicist working on the ATLAS experiment at CERN's Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland. There he uses precision measurements to constrain or characterize physics beyond the standard model. Now, Jon has made important contributions to particle physics theory and phenomenology, and he's also an avid science communicator discussing physics in a wide array of public venues. And in this interview, Jon shares some fantastic stories about his life in science. So, listeners, get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am excited to be here today with Dr. Jon Butterworth. So, Jon, welcome to our show. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
Wonderful. Well, we are excited to chat with you today, but I'm going to start off by giving our listeners just a little bit of information about you. So, listeners, Jon is a professor of physics and head of the Department of Physics and Astronomy at University College London. He received his bachelor's degree in physics and his Ph.D. in particle physics from the University of Oxford. And afterward, Jon was hired by the Pennsylvania State University to conduct postdoctoral research at the Deutsches Elektronen-Synchrotron, or DESY, in Hamburg, Germany, before joining the faculty at UCL, where he is today. Now, Jon is a fellow of the Institute of Physics and recipient of their Chadwick Prize. He has also been awarded the Wolfson Research Merit Award from the Royal Society, an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, and a Particle Physics and Astronomy Research Council Senior Research Fellowship. In addition, listeners, Jon is the author of the book Most Wanted Particle and an author of a blog for The Guardian called Life and Physics. And Jon is here with us today, listeners, to tell us about his experiences in life and science. So, Jon, we want to get to know you today, not only as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start off by telling us about your life outside of science and what you'd like to do?
Are you sure about this?
Yes, we're committed at this point.
Okay. I have two kids who take up a lot of my time, and I enjoy that a lot. But if I think of what my personal hobbies and things that I do to relax when I'm not doing science, I enjoy writing, and I find that that uses a lot of different bits of my brain from doing science. So that does relax me, even though actually it's almost work now as well. I think the main things I do are things that terrify me just enough that I don't think more than 2 minutes ahead, because I get fed up of thinking ahead and strategic planning and things sometimes. So I ski. That's great because I'm not very good at it. So if I take my mind off it, I fall over.
Right.
And I also play the guitar very badly, sometimes on stage, often at my kids' school or something. But again, the fear of not embarrassing yourself, not wanting to embarrass yourself in front of an audience kind of clears your mind of all other long-term worries. And I find that kind of thing very relaxing.
Definitely. It makes you live in the moment, I think.
So those are a couple of things I do anyway.
Well, wonderful to hear about your life outside of science. But Jon, we are going to turn to the science next. You are doing some exciting work. Can you tell our listeners how you describe what you do to someone who's not familiar with your field?
I work on a machine called the Large Hadron Collider at a big lab called CERN in Geneva. And what we do there is we smash particles together at higher energies than anyone's ever done before, and we measure what happens. I guess the big question is why we do that. It doesn't sound like a particularly great thing to do, perhaps.
Sounds like fun, though.
What we're doing really is trying to answer the question, if you take any piece of material and you break it into smaller and smaller bits, what do you get down to in the end? Does that stop? Can you keep breaking it up forever? Or what are the fundamental constituents that you get to? And at the moment, we think that's things we call quarks and electrons and a few other fundamental particles like that, and we're studying those at the Large Hadron Collider. But you can think of it as the world's most powerful microscope, trying to work out what the universe is made of at the very basic, most smallest level.
Well, I think that is a great description of your work, and we are going to dive into more detail on some projects as we chat through our interview. But I want to get a little piece of motivation or inspiration first. I'm a quote person, so bear with me. Can you share with our listeners today one of your favorite motivational or inspirational quotes?
It's from a guy called Max Gluckman, who I know almost nothing else about other than this quote. But the quote is, "A science is any discipline in which the fool of this generation can go beyond the point reached by the genius of the last generation." I really like it because sometimes I feel a fool, but it means I can still contribute to science. And I do like it because it encapsulates the idea that science actually does progress. It doesn't just go around in circles, that we learn genuinely new things. We maybe never know everything, and a lot of knowledge is provisional, but we still know more than people used to. And that's very important to me in my motivation.
Well, I think that is a great quote. And I know as a scientist, it can be frustrating and you just feel like you're going around in circles and not really getting anywhere some days, some weeks, some months even. So this is a great quote.
It means a lot to me. It's actually in the front of my book because I also felt a bit of a fool trying to write a book at some point. So it helped me there too.
Gotcha. So let's take a moment and chat about your work. How did that opportunity come about and what prompted you to write it?
It came from the blog. I think that's how I got an agent interested in me and a publisher in the end. So it really goes back to where did the blog come from? And that was from a little video series I did with a guy called Mike Patterson, which was funded by our research council here. And it was an attempt to try and explain, before the Large Hadron Collider turned on, explain to the people who were paying for it, and school children as well, what it was actually doing. It was a really nice little series of TV things that explained what it was like to be a scientist. But it didn't have any science in it. It was about the people, it was about the environment, and it was very good in that sense. But it was not telling you any physics, really. And there was a review in the Physics World, which is the UK Institute of Physics' magazine, about that, which pointed this out. It was quite complimentary about the films. It said it's a bit of a shame they didn't explain the physics more. So I thought, well, I could do that with a blog. So I started writing a blog to explain the physics behind some of those films, and it kind of snowballed from there. The Guardian picked it up, and then the book came out of that, really, I think. I think the more you write, the easier it gets and the better you get at it. And I think that process started with that.
Well, wonderful to hear more about this book opportunity. And I think myself, it's comforting to hear you say that writing gets easier as you go, because right now it is a struggle for me to write anything. So getting the motivation, being able to sit still for that long, I think is a struggle.
Absolutely, yeah.
So now let's chat about some of the people who've had a big impact on your career, Jon. Can you think about some of these people who've maybe served as mentors or role models to you and tell us about them?
There's a few instances that go right back to my maths teacher at school. It was great because he used to teach us things like how to differentiate before we were supposed to know how to differentiate, and it allowed us to get the right answer to the questions quickly. And that just gave me a great idea of maths as a sort of cheat sheet to the way the universe works, something that stuck with me, definitely inspired me. That was at the stage before I'd even decided that I wanted to do a degree or even A-levels in physics, which is our higher qualifications here. So that he was important. When I started my Ph.D, there was a guy who I'm not going to name because it might embarrass him, but he always used to ask what seemed like really stupid questions in the seminars. He was one of the professors there. And sometimes they were really stupid questions. Often they were not, even though they sounded like they might have been. And always they led to an interesting discussion. And I realized every time I was learning something from the answers. And I was so glad someone was asking these questions and was not afraid to show their ignorance, even if sometimes it was something they should have known already. Why not ask? If you genuinely want the answer, ask the question. And that was a very good lesson to me, I think. And I hope it's something I still live up to. There's a lot of scientists who only ask questions when they know the answer already because they want to prove how smart they are. And he was exactly the opposite. And in the end, I learned a lot through that, both from his questions and about how to be a good scientist, I think. But I'm not going to name him because he might not agree. But it was great. That was a guy at Oxford, and he's a good friend as well. Other than that, my boss at Penn State, a guy called Jim Whitmore, was really great. He left me on a very long leash as a postdoc and was very supportive. My area of science is so collaborative. To go beyond that would be really hard because there are so many people you deal with all the time who are role models and also anti-role models sometimes, I have to say, but generally very positive. So and here at UCL, I've had some fantastic bosses and colleagues as well as students. So I'm afraid I'm kind of not going to pick a particular role model, but those are some examples of people who've been influential and the kind of people who've been influential on me.
Certainly. Well, I want to back up to this question asker. I think that person in the audience, a lot of people are usually very grateful for this person because they are not the only one that has the stupid question or seemingly stupid question. So sometimes it is great to have that person to ask the question that everyone's thinking but too afraid. So
Absolutely, yeah. And as a first-year research student, I needed someone else to ask it for me. Maybe by the third year, I was confident enough to ask it myself.
Right. Well, wonderful to hear about some of these people who've had a big impact. And I want to rewind a little bit farther and hear about what started you on this path to science. You mentioned an early teacher inspiring you, getting you interested in math. But what was your first memory of being interested in math, science, or physics?
My first memory is me and my little brother and a friend of ours deciding to write a book containing all that everyone knew about space and stars and planets.
Oh, wow. That's an undertaking.
Yeah, and I think I must have been about 9, and my brother was only 5, so we were pretty...
Wow. Was he the illustrator for that book, just drawing the doodles?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we were really serious about it for a little while. A friend of mine was my age as well. So obviously before that, I must have been interested in stars and planets and astronomy and things, and I don't remember how that came about, really. But I do remember the lesson of that book, which was not only were we totally overfaced by how much there was, it was the point at which we realised that it was changing all the time, and new information was being found out by these space missions and by new telescopes and the development of the theory. So every time we read something and thought we'd written about it, then there was no guarantee that that was going to last very long because it was changing a lot. And that was a real strong lesson to me. That really excited me, actually. I mean, we gave up on the book immediately, obviously, but sure. It really excited me about this this idea of the growth of the sum of human knowledge. And I remember thinking, I don't care how small it is, I want to find out something new for the first time, and I want to be able to make my contribution to that kind of sum of human knowledge. Which sounds very grandiose for a 10-year-old, but I'm pretty sure that's an accurate memory. And after that, I didn't become completely single-minded there. I had many ups and downs with science, and I got into art and writing and English and things, music as well. So I wasn't kind of single-minded, absolutely fixated on a science career from that moment, but that's definitely a motivation that stayed with me.
So then what turned you towards this career in science ultimately? Can you hit on some of these key steps, some of these big moments along the way that really got you to where you are today?
Those are 2 of them. I don't remember the point that I decided to do physics as a degree, because that's clearly a really important point. I knew that I loved the maths, but only because of it telling you something about the real world or the physical world. Mm-hmm. So I guess that was a really important step. And maybe it was about that point that I thought, right, I'm going to do a degree of physics at university if I can. No one in my family had been to university before, so even deciding I wanted to go to university was quite a big step. But I think that came about there. And then the research degree, I think that's when that earlier motivation came back. It's like, okay, I've been learning all this stuff and doing exams. Now I want to learn something that no one ever knew before that isn't in a textbook already. And I think that's why I stayed in research. But even when I remember thinking, even when I went into the research degree, I thought, well, I'll try it. And I don't know whether I'm going to carry on being a physicist. But I found I actually I really enjoyed the research a lot. I also enjoyed programming, and I remember being given my supervisor, Doug Gingrich. I should have mentioned him as one of the influential people because he was great too. He really didn't want a student, I don't think. He was really too busy to have a new student. And he dumped a load of Fortran code on me that he knew he'd have to sort out at some point, and he just thought it would keep me quiet. Mm-hmm. And I really enjoyed unpicking it. And in the end, I remember the look on his face still when I took it back to him, and it was 1/5 of the length of the original code he'd given me. It worked twice as fast and it did everything properly. And it was like him thinking, my God, PhD students can be useful after all. And I was thinking, I could do this. I'm quite good at this. I like this. It was that sense of having done something because it was useful to someone else, not because it had taught me how to pass an exam. That was important. So there's no one kind of the road to Damascus moment where I suddenly became a fixated physicist, but all of those are milestones on the way.
Definitely. Well, I love that story that you shared about getting involved in the programming. I think that's one of the things that a lot of scientists grumble about is having to write these programs and code for their work. But fantastic to hear that was something that excited you and got you interested in this path. And I want to back up to the point you mentioned that no one in your family had gone to university. Was this something where you felt pressure not to, or were your family supportive of your decision?
Oh, they were hugely supportive. They were thrilled. My parents had some higher education. They were actually qualified teachers, so they hadn't done a university degree, but they had done some education after school. Their parents had very little education, actually. So, yeah, they were keen. They saw the value of education, and they were great help and supportive, but it was all a bit alien to them sometimes, I think, as well.
Absolutely. I know I was in a similar position where neither of my parents went to college, so I sort of didn't really know what to expect when I was going into college, but they were very supportive as well. So great to hear that you had that family support behind you as you went on your journey. But now, Jon, I want to talk about how you got to where you are today at CERN. So can you give us a little bit about your transition into your current position?
Sure. So as you said in the introduction, all those awards and things, a bit embarrassing, but you did say I worked for Penn State and then joined UCL after that. And the thing about having a faculty position is, of course, that you start thinking about your own research career in the long term, and you can start choosing more what to do rather than working as a research assistant on a predefined project. And I carried on at Hamburg for a couple of years, but it was clear that that experiment there had a lifetime that was going to finish in a few years after that. And I was actively looking around for what to do. And UCL had a group working on the Atlas experiment already at CERN. And it was a good chance for me to get involved and see an experiment being built and actually designed some of it as well. particularly some of the electronics we worked on and managing a little group of engineers and technical staff. So I was doing that sort of part-time while I was still doing my physics at Hamburg. I was helping build Atlas at CERN. And then once we got our data coming in, obviously, I think really then you have to focus on one experiment that's producing data. So that would be about 2007 when I moved completely to working on Atlas. With these very large projects, it's fantastic to have a university like UCL that gives you the freedom, but also the long-term support to commit to those things and spend years building an experiment when you know you're not going to get data from it for another 5-6 years. But then, of course, when we do get data, it's spectacular. So it was kind of natural progression, really, from the experiment I was doing at Hamburg as part of my Ph.D., where we were actually studying the internal structure of the proton, then to go to the Large Hadron Collider, where we're using proton collisions to understand the structure of nature and to look for the Higgs boson and other things. The knowledge that I gained from Hamburg was really essential in that, and it was a very exciting thing to do, but also a very natural thing to do, I think.
Certainly. And now we've talked a little bit about the Atlas experiment here, and I think the word experiment doesn't quite capture the magnitude of this undertaking. I think you need a stronger word there. Myself and a graduate student can do an experiment, quote unquote, in a Friday afternoon, but this is huge. I mean, there are thousands of physicists working on it. It has gone on for years. So can you tell us a little bit more about this exciting project?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's huge. And really, it's a continuous series of many, many experiments, I would say, in terms of individual scientific results that can come from it. I mentioned before that what we're doing with the Large Hadron Collider is colliding protons together at unprecedentedly high energies. What Atlas is, you can think of it, if you like, as the fastest, biggest, most precise digital camera we could build. We surround the point where the protons collide by this detector, and we record everything we possibly can about what happens in those collisions. Many hundreds of particles are produced in those collisions, and we need to know what kind of particle they are, where they came from, where they're going, what their energy is, all those kind of things. So Atlas is a collaboration of several thousand physicists and engineers that built the detector that we call Atlas, the Atlas detector. And when the LHC is running, that detector runs flat out recording data. That data is then shipped all around the world to all the collaborating countries, including the UK and the US, and analysed by physicists like me on their laptops in the end. Kind of mining that data is almost like doing many different experiments as well, because there's so much going on in those collisions. You can pick out all kinds of different physical results from that as well. When we talk about the Atlas experiment, we really mean that whole thing. We mean the detector, the collaboration, the continuous stream of data that we get from the collisions, and the things we learn from it and publish in journals.
Certainly. So is there a particular sub-experiment that you're working on that you want to highlight as one of these exciting projects you're part of?
One of the things that I've worked on, particularly on Atlas, is, you should be clear that they're not sub-experiments in the sense that everyone has access to all the data. So it's not like you turn up, do your experiment and go home. Mm-hmm. The whole thing runs 24/7 when it's running, and everyone in the whole collaboration gets access to all the data. But one of the things I was particularly pleased with and worked on in this was to do with the search for the Higgs boson, which is the particle that validates our understanding of what the mass of fundamental particles really is, actually. So it was one of the top things on the to-do list for the Large Hadron Collider, if you like. I worked out a way with a theorist friend of mine how to identify Higgs bosons in a particular way that they can decay when they're produced in a particular fashion. And we had a little theory paper on that, and then it was really nice to see that through the experiment and actually do the measurement. The theory paper came out in 2008, and 4 years later we had a measurement using those techniques. That was one of the things that I'm particularly pleased with. Actually, this isn't a Higgs decay, one of the ways the Higgs boson decays. We haven't actually seen that through completely, in that we didn't actually observe it in that mode with the previous LHC data, but the data we're taking now should do it. So that's a kind of ongoing project that is kind of personally important to me, that I'm interested in. There are several others as well, and typically a physicist on one of these experiments will have one or two main things they work on, but will be involved to a greater or lesser extent in many of these things actually as well. So there's a lot happening at the moment. This is the conference season. In fact, tomorrow I'm off to Chicago for a meeting called Boost, where a lot of these results will be shown from my experiments, some of which I'm involved in, some of which I'm not.
Well, fantastic. Sounds like you are keeping quite busy there with all this exciting work. And I know the Higgs boson discoveries really created quite a stir in the media. A lot of people got really excited about them. So phenomenal work there. And I know we've so far talked about a lot of the exciting things that you're working on, a lot of the wonderful aspects of your career and how you got there. But we haven't yet talked about the challenges and the stumbling blocks. And I know every scientist, no matter how glorious their path, has these stumbling blocks, faces these failures and challenges. So can you take a moment, Jon, to tell us about one of yours and how you got through it to become a successful scientist?
I could take one very small one and one very big one, I think. But the big one, is a bit of a cheat because it's sort of impersonal. But if people were paying attention in the media in 2008, when we turned on the experiment, the Large Hadron Collider, in a kind of blaze of glory and fanfare after many years of preparation, we broke it 9 days later. Part of it blew up, unfortunately, and we were absolutely devastated. I call it a bit of a cheat because it affected thousands of us, and it wasn't my fault.
Diffused responsibility, yeah.
Exactly. But nevertheless, I was running the UK part of the collaboration then and had a load of new PhD students who just joined, and I had to stand up in front of them and say, the party's over for another year, I'm afraid. It was very depressing. But on the other hand, while the machine was being repaired, we did a lot of good prep work. It made us think, okay, we're not doing this for the party feeling. We're doing this, we're going to get there in the end kind of thing. I think in the end, we did a lot of preparatory work on how we would make the measurements in that following year. That probably in the end made the results better and probably not much later than they would have been either. So, yeah, it was a test of strength of character, I think. It was pretty horrible. The other one was, before I told you about my supervisor giving me this code to fix, and that was fun when I fixed it. What we were trying to do was emulate a selection algorithm for the experiment in Hamburg. And this was all written in some fancy parallel processing code that would run online and was impossible to debug. And I was supposed to emulate it all in Fortran offline as well, which would be easier to debug. And we got this. We spent weeks and months preparing this, designing the algorithms, checking that they mirrored each other completely in test rigs. And then we turned on the experiment and nothing made any sense.
Oh, no.
We're completely wrong. So my beautiful Fortran was producing nonsense results. The online algorithm was producing nonsense results, and they were different nonsense results, and we really didn't understand why. So that was a blow. That was a terrible 24 hours or something when I thought that my 6 months of my PhD work had been a waste of time. Actually, again, I'm cheating a bit because after 24 hours, we worked out what was going wrong and we fixed it. And it was actually, in the end, proved that having the idea of having the code emulate this stuff was valuable because it was only via my code that we managed to debug the thing. But it was a terrifying and an anticlimax because we've been waiting for the data for ages, and terrifying when it didn't make any sense. And there was a few hours of panic, I would say there. But both of those teach you some kind of strength of character. Science is always steps forward and steps back, and you always hope it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but sometimes it doesn't feel that way.
Definitely. And can you tell us a little bit how you made it through this 24 hours? What was going through your mind and what kept you going rather than just walking away from it altogether?
I think it was anger in the end. I mean, maybe for the first hour it was blind panic and I didn't do anything. I think I probably just banged my head against a wall or something. But then it was like, no, come on. It was a conviction that there has to be a logical answer somewhere, I think. Particularly in my code, it was the fact that my code was giving nonsense results as well. And I thought, look, I understand this inside out. If I can't debug this, no one else in the world can. There's a rational solution. And I just got really angry with the fact that I couldn't see it. And I just decided, well, as long as it takes, I will just break this down into pieces and do it. And having some experience with coding, you realize in the end you probably can do that with most problems. I mean, a piece of code is something you made yourself. It can be a lot harder to debug an experiment where you've got real physical unknowns. Debugging nature is a lot more tricky. But debugging code in the end, if you just get down, put your head down and are determined, you'll find the answer in the end.
Right.
So definitely I remember being very angry. Not really with myself, just with the code.
Right. Which I think it helps to make the code the scapegoat because ultimately the computer is doing exactly what you've told it to, but it's easier to blame the code.
If you're interested, it turned out that the problem was a faulty assumption rather than a bug in the code. So we'd assumed that all the hits would come in order of the number of the wire they were on, and in fact they came in order of the time that the particle arrived, which sounds like obviously true after the fact, but we just made this stupid wrong assumption right from the beginning. Anyway.
Well, yeah, I think it is these assumptions, though, that can often tank whole experiments, whole modeling systems, computer programs, things like that, because you don't even think about them. It's just, oh, yeah, we'll just code this in real quick. And then it's way harder when you're going through to trying to troubleshoot. Well, Jon, we don't just want to talk about your tough times, although these were some fantastic examples and lesson learned to share with our listeners. But can you tell us next about one of your success stories, one of these exciting moments and how you dealt with it?
Yeah, again, I'm never quite sure whether to go with the small personal ones or big, kind of more shared ones, but clearly the discovery of the Higgs boson was amazing. It was a fantastic moment to see that succeed and to have all the technology and all the preparatory work and all the different people working on it boil down into the end, is there a bump in this distribution or not? And be watching this for 2 years to work out whether there was a bump there. And in the end, having enough statistics in the data to see that there really was one. And seeing that announced and seeing our understanding of the universe changed at that point. That was just an amazing thing to be part of, and I was quite intimately involved in bits of that. Of course, it was shared with at least 6,000 other people, so it's maybe not that personal, but it felt very personal at the time.
So do you remember where you were exactly and what you were doing when you saw this bump in the distribution for the first time?
There were two steps, really. So one was a collaboration meeting, an internal meeting at CERN, and I was in the audience there, and I knew the first look at the data from 2012. We'd had a hint of it in 2011, and the first analysis of the data from the new data from 2012 was going to be shown in that meeting. Usually in our meetings, people upload their slides to a web page first, so you can kind of sneak peek ahead and see what's going on, which is bad, actually, because then you don't listen to the talk properly and probably end up doing emails and miss the talk. But in this case, they hadn't uploaded the slides, so you think, yeah, this is going to be interesting. You think, yeah, they know it's going to be interesting. They want us to listen to the talk.
Building anticipation, yeah.
And to see then that there was a hint in the data in 2012 in the same place. Now, actually, scientifically, that wasn't the moment of discovery because it was formally not finished and it was not statistically significant enough to call it a discovery. But your gut feeling was, come on, this looks real at that point. So that was the moment my opinion changed to saying there probably isn't a Higgs boson to saying there probably is. But then the formal announcement was actually on the 4th of July in 2012. And I was in London because I was involved in the UK. I had to be there with the UK science minister and all kinds of stuff. And watching the head of our experiment, Fabiola Giannotti, present our results in that environment was surprisingly emotional, I have to say. And when she said, it's 5 sigma and showed it, and there was this big round of applause and Peter Higgs was in tears and all this it was just fantastic. So yeah, I remember that very well.
Well, that sounds phenomenal. Now, you mentioned that you also had some personal successes. Do you want to share one of these smaller personal ones?
Stupidly enough, debugging that damn code as well. Life is made of those little satisfactions. The first time your supervisor gives you a tough job and you crack it. There have been a number of things that I'm pretty pleased with. Developing this idea to find the Higgs boson and when it decays to B quarks was another one. That came out of a meeting that we had somewhere in the French Alps at a place called Les Houches. And this colleague of mine, Gavin Salam, and I were kicking around ideas, and so many ideas come along and then you look into them and you go, you get excited and you look into them and it wasn't such a good idea after all, or someone else has already done that is very common. And seeing that one through and finding, I won't go into the technical details of what it was, but it was pretty neat and no one had done it before. And it took us 6 months and we were all the time scared that that the next day there would be on the archive a paper with this in it and we would have wasted our time, or at least we'd be second anyway, rather than first, and we wanted to be first. And then putting that out there and having it stand up to the peer review and the criticism of our colleagues was pretty good. So, I think that's something most scientists would identify with, and that was much more personal because it was only me and my colleague, my theory colleague, and our 2 PhD students. So there were only 4 of us on the paper. So it was a very different feeling from 6,000 people finding the Higgs boson, but in some ways it has some things in common.
Definitely. Well, I think this is a great story as well, and I think it really highlights that sort of thrilling race to be first in science that a lot of scientists have experienced. Often ends in disappointment, but when it ends in success, it is so exciting. So wonderful story to share with us today. And I know we chatted a little bit in the beginning of our interview about the book that you've written, and I love talking books with all the guests we have on our program. So John, I want to know what you're reading these days. So can you share with us one of your favorite books or one of the books you have on your shelf now?
Sure. What I'm reading at the moment is a non-fiction book about physics in the Third Reich, bizarrely, and about how Max Planck and Peter Debye and Werner Heisenberg and people dealt with the National Socialists in 1930s Germany and beyond. So that's pretty frightening and depressing in places, I have to say. That's what I'm reading right now, and it's very good. I knew you were going to ask about books, and I was thinking, what's the best book I've read recently that's not some kind of non-fiction thing? And it's definitely The Baroque Cycle by Neil Stephenson, which is a sort of slightly magical, realist, historical, science fiction epic, I guess. All of those words apply at some level. I don't read those kind of things very much. It's very fat. I have quite a short attention span for books, so it's 3 quite fat books, actually. There's no way I would have considered reading it, even though I'd read some Neil Stephenson stuff before and quite liked it. There's no way I'd have committed to a 3 fat book trilogy.
Right. It is an investment at that point, yeah.
Except that it was recommended to me twice. Once by a friend of mine here who's an electronic engineer working on Atlas, and the other time by my sister-in-law who's a historian. They both think it's brilliant and correct about the things they know. So the history in there was correct and dealt with properly. And the technology and the science was correct, or at least plausible, until the bit where it got magically realist anyway. And I really thought, imagine a Venn diagram with an overlap of a historian and an electronic engineer. That's got to be worth paying attention.
Right. Very few books fall in the middle.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I read it and I really enjoyed it, and I still think about it quite a lot. It's really exciting, but also quite thought-provoking. So that's the best book I've read recently.
Well, excellent recommendation. We will put that out there for our listeners who are in search of their next great read, and we'll put your book out there as well. And Jon, we've talked a little bit about your different adventures in science, but I want to talk about the places that you've traveled to. I think travel is such an integral part of the career of a scientist that we want to share some of your travel memories today. So can you tell us about your favorite place that you visited for science?
My favourite place is definitely Hamburg, which we've already mentioned. Not particularly exotic, maybe, but I'd never been on an aeroplane until my first flight as a PhD student to Hamburg.
Really?
I was totally excited. I must confess, one of the reasons that I didn't mention before as to why I got into particle physics was because I knew I'd get to travel and I was really keen to travel. We never went on holidays abroad and things when I was a kid, and my work forced me to travel. Was my dream job, basically. So Hamburg was brilliant, and I loved it. I ended up living there for a few years as well, and it's a fantastic city. I definitely recommend it. In particular, they have a magnificent model railway there now as well, but maybe that's just too geeky.
Nothing's too geeky, yeah.
So slightly less geeky. There's a really good nightlife there, and we used to play in a little band in bars. It was a lot of fun. So it's not particularly exotic, but it's good. But I went on a week's tour of South Korea shortly after that, which was really exciting. Visited Japan a couple of times, which I really liked, particularly Osaka for some reason. I like cities. It's funny, I visited some very beautiful places for conferences as well, but I tend to remember the cities. I think it's because I grew up in Manchester and I live in London. I think I'm definitely a city person. So Sao Paulo was the most recently city I went to, and that was fantastic as well. Really enjoyed that.
I'm definitely one of these people where I love visiting cities and kind of taking it all in, but I don't know if I could ever live in a really big city. So wonderful to hear about some of your travel opportunities, and interesting to hear that you played in a band in Hamburg. So this was part of your terrifying guitar playing experiences that you like to keep yourself doing?
Absolutely was. Calling it a band might be a bit strong. It was me on the guitar and my wife on the violin, and a friend of ours called Chandy singing and playing the guitar as well. She's in a band now called Sunday Driver, who are very good. So she was the serious musician amongst us. I think we were just filling in, but it was a lot of fun anyway.
Well, that sounds lovely and wonderful, like I said, to hear about some of these opportunities you get to travel as a scientist, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that is such a big part of the career. But I think in addition to the travel, in addition to the fantastic work you get to do, you get to work with some wonderful people. And we've touched on a couple times throughout our conversation some of the collaborations you've been able to do with some of the fantastic groups of people you've gotten to work with. And I want to talk about the human side of science for a bit. So I want to hear one of these stories that you have of just funny or fond memories that you've shared with people, or even one of these wonderful traditions that you've had at one of the places you've worked.
One of the weirdest ones I had, I remember actually the first trip to Hamburg. They have this tradition at DESY. I'm not even sure whether it's all over Germany, but it's definitely in DESY in Hamburg, that they don't applaud when someone gives a talk in a meeting. They don't applaud them. They knock on the table.
Really?
Which is very disconcerting if you're not expecting it. So you go there and give your first ever talk, and if you're unlucky and you've not heard this before, then you just don't know whether they're all really angry with you or what does this mean, you know? So, by the time I gave a talk there, I'd heard this happen a lot, but it was quite fun watching people who were there for their first meeting look around in shock when everyone started banging on the table at the end of the talk. It was a bit of a sport watching the new students and any new collaborator just be a little taken aback by this. And it was so much part of the culture that you didn't even think it was odd.
So what did they do in a situation where, say, you're in a talk and it's just a bunch of chairs? What if there is no table?
Maybe they would stoop to clapping at that point, but I don't remember, actually.
It is critical to the operation.
Yeah.
Well, that is a wonderful tradition.
I was looking for something odd to idiosyncrasy from CERN as well, but there are so many of them that it's hard to choose. But one thing that your listeners might be interested in is that there's a photo album, I think, on Tumblr called Lonely Chairs at CERN, and if you Google that, you'll find it anyway, which is just lovely. It's his pictures of chairs at CERN in random places, often on fire escapes with people who've been smoking, but also down in the tunnel, or people put a chair there to do a job and then they leave the chair behind. And there's all these it just gives you a real kind of nice feel for the slightly grungy mood of CERN with these chairs wandering around. So I think if you're looking for idiosyncratic view of CERN, I recommend Lonely Chairs at CERN.
I like it. That sounds fantastic. So do these chairs just accumulate? Is there someone assigned to cleaning up the chairs every now and then?
You put your finger on it. There is no chair monitor at CERN.
That is the problem.
By someone doing a job and it never moves.
Gotcha. Well, I'm going to have to check out this Lonely Chairs of CERN. Listeners, you should also check it out. And I love hearing about these different traditions, these fun memories that scientists share together, because I think it highlights the fact that even though you're so serious about the work that you're doing and it is really important, science is done by people and you like to have fun. So yeah. Great examples today. And now we've talked a little bit about some of the work that you've done and some of the big questions that you're working to answer. But I want to know, if we gave you everything, if things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility were not a problem at all, Jon, what is the one question, if you had to pick one, that you would want to answer first?
I want to know what dark matter is. It's as simple as that, really. We know from astrophysical observations that there's a lot of stuff out there in the universe that interacts via gravitation, but doesn't appear to interact much any other way. We can tell this from the way galaxies rotate and from the way light passes from long distances to us and bends around mass. It's very annoying for a particle physicist because it doesn't seem to be made up of the particles in the standard model. There's a small chance it might be, but it doesn't fit at the moment, and that's just really annoying. It's more than 75% of the universe, really. It's the biggest open question, I think, that we have in this area of science. There's a chance we might make it. If it's a new kind of particle, we might make that matter at the Large Hadron Collider and might understand it that way. And we have people around the world, including here at UCL, who are looking for it in very quiet experiments underground in mines, hoping to see the very faint interactions of this stuff with normal matter. And there are astronomers, astrophysicists studying the evidence for it from space and seeing if we can get more clues as to the nature of it from that. When there are such three different ways of addressing one problem, that's really exciting. And I really hope that during my career we get an answer to that. I really hope we get one actually within a couple of years from the Large Hadron Collider. But I really just want to know whether it's me that finds out or someone else. I just want to know the answer.
Well, I really like how you describe this problem of what is dark matter as annoying. I think some of these emotions, this annoyance, this anger, can be really productive, motivating emotions in science.
In physics at the moment with the Higgs, right, we've got the standard model is sort of complete and internally consistent. And you think, well, job done, why don't we go home? But there are these outstanding questions which, like dark matter, which just don't fit with it. And it is annoying, frankly. We think we've got something we'd like to claim is a theory of everything nearly, and it clearly doesn't explain more than 75% of the universe. It's annoying. It
is. Well, you'll have your work cut out for you, all you physicists. Jon, thanks for dreaming big, talking about these big questions in your mind. And we love to leave our listeners with little pieces of advice that they can carry forward in their lives and in their science. So can you share with us today what you would consider the best piece of advice is that you've ever received yourself?
Okay, it's got to come with a health warning because advice depends on the circumstances.
Right, the fine print disclaimer.
There's no piece of advice that works in all circumstances, I think. Maybe that's a piece of advice.
Done and done.
I think the most actively useful advice I ever got was when I was applying for my job at UCL, which is a faculty position, and I was a postdoc, quite a young postdoc. I'd only done one. And I was quite nervous. I was going, should I go? Is this too early for me to apply for such a job? And one of my senior friends, if you like, said, well, go along for the interview anyway and interview them. See if you want the job, see if you think you can do it and see if you want to do it and treat the interview that way and just take it as experience. And I approached it with that attitude. Obviously it worked because they offered me the job and I actually decided I did want to work here. But it somehow took a lot of the fear out of the interview. It allowed me to talk frankly and honestly without either overcompensating and being too confident, but also without being too nervous. So that was a really active, good piece of advice that had an immediate effect. I'm not recommending that approach to every single interview, but it certainly worked for me on that occasion.
Well, I think this is a really good example of great advice because I think when you're going through interviews, I think a lot of us have been on the other end of the interview where you're interviewing people and you can tell when someone is not maybe invested in the questions or they're not really asking the right questions. So it sounds like if you're taking this approach where you are interviewing the institution as well, you're going to ask some of those big questions that people will be impressed by. So
yeah, that's right.
Well, great example of advice that you received that was helpful for you in your journey. Is there any other last piece of advice, Jon, or any last note of inspiration that you want to end our talk on today?
I can only give the things that inspire me, and one of them is this idea of adding to the sum of human knowledge. There was another great book I read, actually, by a guy called Graham Farmiloe, which was about Paul Dirac, who is one of the wonderful 20th century scientists. He's a guy whose theory basically put together quantum mechanics and special relativity and predicted antimatter, which is quite a big deal. And he didn't believe in any afterlife or anything like that. He was fundamentally materialist in his approach to life. But he cared deeply about the future and about human knowledge. And the one thing that distressed him was the idea that at some point the human race might die out and the bit of knowledge about the Dirac equation would die away. And he wasn't thinking of that in an egotistical way. He was just thinking this is such a beautiful thing that life has learned about the universe it lives in that it should not disappear. That works for me as well. I like that idea that small bits of the universe, finding out more about the rest of the universe and passing that knowledge on, I find really inspirational. And that probably takes you right back to how I started being a scientist in the first place. I think the other more practical bit of advice, especially if people are getting into science as a career, is never put up with rubbish now as a means to a future reward. It's so competitive in science. The only way to play the game, to get anything out of it, is to do what you love. And the moment you stop loving it, with a science degree and the skills you've got, you can probably earn a lot more money somewhere else. And I see a lot of people lose the joy of science because they get essentially taken advantage of sometimes in the system, and the system can be very brutal sometimes. So don't lose the joy of science, and if you do, then get out and do something else for a while at least, and maybe come back later. It may be easy for me to say that because I was very lucky in my career. I got a long-term job early on, but I've seen it work with other people. Don't destroy your life. Don't make too many compromises for science. If you're not enjoying what you're doing and it's destroying your home life and your family life, then get out and do something else, at least for a while. If you're still enjoying the science, then that's fantastic. But don't be used by senior colleagues, because often you won't get the payback, unfortunately, because it's just too competitive. There aren't many jobs. Maybe that's a bit bleak. Sorry, not very inspirational.
Well, I think you brought up a good point here in terms of it's not worth it to be miserable now for this sort of goal potentially that you have maybe in the future. You have to love the process of whatever you're doing, and whether that's a career in academic science or whether that's a career in industry or kind of whatever direction you want to take that. Find something that you love, the everyday grind, the process. And yeah, there's going to be days you don't love, but if you overall are happy, then that's where you should be. And if you're not there, you should find something that will take you there.
Thank you. You said it much better than me, but that's exactly what I meant.
Well, Jon, wonderful note to end on. Can you tell our listeners, if they want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
Probably the easiest thing is to look me up on Twitter. My handle there is Jon M. Butterworth, Jon without an H. And also my Guardian blog is called Life and Physics. It's pretty easy to find as well.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out Jon's Twitter profile and also find his blog out there. Fantastic articles. And Jon, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
It's a real pleasure to speak to you. Thanks.
Well, it was a delight to chat with you. And listeners, as always, fantastic to have you here. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.